Who we are, who we were, and who we're destined to become are all reflections of the stories we tell, of gods and devils from tales of the heart to those of fear and foreboding. Stories shape us and the world we live in. Myths, folk tales, and even religious parables all define our cultures and beliefs. In each episode of Faith and Fear, we will dip our toes into the comparative narratives spanning the globe, considering the concepts and archetypes common to us all. Enle, Shalom, and Prazir. Hello and peace. It's a pleasure. Thanks for following me down the rabbit hole once again on my journey to better understand the stories and beliefs that shape us. Myth is what we call other people's religion. Joseph Campbell. This week is going to be a first for Faith and Fear. Joining me today are Nicole and Matt Shaw of Mythological. Thanks for joining us. How are you two doing today?
Amazing.
I'm doing great.
This week has been quite an interesting week. That's saying the least. Yeah.
And that it has.
Huge roller coaster.
Yeah.
Could you two tell us a little bit about yourselves and give us a little on your background?
Absolutely. Nicole, you want ladies first?
Okay, fine. Hi. Yeah, I am an actor, but I'm an aspiring showrunner. I started as an actor as a child, running to auditions for commercials, other things, not really getting a lot of luck. Then at one point I wanted to be a doctor, so then I went to university to study public health. Came back and decided, you know what, medicine's really not for me. I want to go back into the thing that I grew up doing. So I'm trying to be an actor again. I'm currently in an acting conservatory, but while I'm doing that, I want to make stories and I want to create a show. And hopefully in the future, I'd love to be a runner of my own show, which leads me here.
A runner of your own show / showrunner.
Ooh, yes.
And I'm Matt Ipshaw. I'm also, my main trade is in acting and the theater. But I've recently fallen into this role of producer and showrunner, and we're developing this really. I think it's a game-changing animation, an adult animated series, and I think it's going to be very important, especially in the world and what's happening in it today. You know.
Yeah. I guess it's good to. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I guess it's good to mention the title of our show, which is, of course, Mythological with an I, so it's Mythological. I'm really excited about it.
No, I actually love that. So what exactly is Mythological?
So it's basically it's a show that takes place on a floating island world above what humans know as the Bermuda Triangle. We call it the Plains. In the Plains, we follow 4, I guess you'd call them lesser deities or smaller gods from their sons and daughters and offspring of bigger mythologies and bigger religions we know. One of our main characters is Cthulhu Jr., who is the offspring of Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft. We have a couple others. Basically, Mythological follows this gang of 4 misfits as they go through the world of the Plains. Yeah.
They're coming into themselves. They're in the equivalent of college. You know, they're past the point where they're no longer in the control of their parents, and they're trying to make names for themselves. But the problem is that there's a lot going on in the world where in the Plains, you know, your success is determined by the number of followers you have. The bigger the following, the bigger the god you are. And for these lesser misfit deities, how are they supposed to prove themselves to be great when they have such an obstacle ahead of them? So that's kind of the backstory and the concept behind the show. And we're really excited to start exploring all of these myths and religions and bringing in this really culturally diverse world that resembles our own in a sense.
I think that's one of the main driving key factors of this show is bringing all these cultures and religions and these characters and deities from everywhere into one location and seeing what happens. Yeah, so it's gonna be fun to find out.
I love that. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Right.
The first time I actually saw your project, I loved the ideas that you guys were putting out there and the whole concept in general. What made you guys decide to take on this project?
Matt, do you want to start?
That's a good question. So this is actually the idea was sort of based off of 3 of our main characters, and they've sort of been brewing around for about 10 years before we actually started to do anything with them. And I guess what drew me to the project was just the potential to, it's just so culturally diverse as well, and just the potential to bring everything together. So we actually think we didn't start doing anything on this until March, a year ago?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. So I met you around July, August of 2019. You brought this idea to me, and I was like, I love it. I see exactly where this is going. We originally started with the characters Cthulhu Jr., Kuna, which comes from like Polynesian, like this little surfer dude, and then the character Lil G, who's this tiny little monk, little Buddhist monk. And, I just saw the power in how we've got a group of nobodies, and there's something way more to that. And what really drew me to it, and what really drew me to it was that, my whole life in terms of my relationship with religiosity, I was always wondering why we can't seem to get along, why like people from different religions were fighting over things that sometimes we have similar values or we have similar characters within these religions. And I was like, what is it that we can do to bring us together? And so Matt introduced me to this idea, and I was totally running with it. And then I said, okay, I love this little group. I love Cthulhu Jr., I love Kuna, I love Little G, but we need a female voice. We need a female influence in this group. And so I added the character Sheena, who is like this totally made up, forgotten daughter of the god Shiva from Hinduism. And so we created this little band, and then now we're starting to see and develop where these 4 young adults can go. So that's how I got involved.
Yeah, and Nicole articulates it way better than I. I think that's the main reason that drew me to it.
I love that. I love the inspiration behind that, and that you actually have somewhere you want to go with the whole story and the concept, and that you have just a whole drive and direction moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
And then also I think another thing about it too is that I also got tired of seeing religions being like made fun of or attacked, because I don't really think that there's anything horribly wrong with religion in itself, but I think where things go wrong is how people have decided to use religion. Right. And so that's also like, I think a benefit to the show is that we're not wanting to like downplay religion, or we don't want to say like all religion is bad, religion has only destroyed the world. We're saying we have good elements to what these foundations are, but let's see how we can explore how things have delineated and gone so wrong, and how things have gone so right. So we want to celebrate, but also like take into account that there's things that can be analyzed, and there's not really a place where we can talk about religion openly. It's a taboo subject. Nobody wants to touch it. And so we want to take the risk to say, let's talk about it. Let's use it as a framework, because religions and myths have been a framework for our entire histories as a people.
And it's becoming so segmented too, right? I mean, it already is, but it's like politics, you know? Just the longer we go on, you know, the more divided we are, right?
I totally agree. And that's one of the things that actually drew me to Mythological, because those are some of the same ideas and thoughts that made me want to start the Faith and Fear podcast and focus on comparative theology and mythology, because as you said, a lot of these things, they're not bad. These religions aren't bad. It's how we've come to use them. It's how people have come to weaponize them. And a lot of them have the same principles and motivation, but yet we argue over the semantics.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess that's a good way to segue into the actual body of this episode. Very recently, I've discussed the topic of magic and ritual in a number of different belief systems. Such practices can range from being modest and simple to elaborate and noteworthy. How important do you believe ritual and ceremony are to everyday life?
I think they're so important. Everybody has a different relationship to these rituals and to these religions, and how much are they buying into these rituals is, dependent on the person. But what I like to think about as an example is I'm half Japanese. I grew up going and visiting Japan very often with my mom, and we would always take trips to Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines and learning as much about the culture as possible. And one thing that my mom made me do, and I hated it as a kid, but like she would make me do these Japanese tea ceremonies, and they're super tedious. They're very long. They're very structured. It's definitely more complicated than it needs to be, which is a very Japanese trait. We make everything more complicated than we need to. And
I feel like that's a trait of all religions, honestly.
That's
sometimes.
true. Yeah. I mean, yeah, definitely. But and at first I was like, oh, this is just like an everyday practice. This is just part of the culture that tea ceremonies exist. But then it wasn't until I was in college and I was in a Japanese religions class that I learned that tea ceremonies were used as a meditation practice in Zen Buddhism. It's directly tied to religiosity, but it's been, separated and become secular. And so that tie has been kind of erased, which I think is interesting, but we still do it without knowing necessarily why. We just do it because it's part of culture, which I think is kind of a fascinating into rituals.
The context is lost.
Yeah, the context is lost, but then, we're still doing it, and there's plenty of examples with other things. So I think it's also important for people to be able to recognize that we may be doing things because we say that's part of, our traditions or our cultures, but a lot of them have context in religious practices, which it will be interesting in our show to kind of explore those things, but also in everyday life to just start taking notice of those things.
That's the thing, yeah, in everyday life as well. We don't realize how much. What really stood out for me when researching all this and coming up with all these ideas is that ceremonies and rituals are not just religious, right? You think about it, we wake up every day, we brush our teeth, we go to work, blah blah blah, come back, have dinner, go to sleep at the exact same times, at the exact same place, right?
Exactly.
And if anything is thrown off, we get so flustered. And right. I think that's going to be a fun aspect to explore in Mythological as well. It's not just the religious aspect, but also the, like Nicole said, everyday happenings, right?
Doing my own research on rituals, one of the things that was brought up was that outside of religious or spiritual context, ritual is said to be an 'an 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 even if it's simply the chaos of daily life. We have rituals, things we do every day that basically give us comfort. And we often feel discomfort, like you said, when we aren't able to do these things.
I like that a lot.
What about like modern rituals, you know? Like when I think about rituals too in that context, Sheldon, is like, what about Instagram? Like part of my daily ritual when I wake up in the morning is I immediately scroll on Instagram. I'm not even thinking about it. Mm-hmm. I'm not even necessarily enjoying the things I'm looking at on Instagram, but I still do it, which
it's literally just a mindless act. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, things like that have definitely become modern rituals. Just like you said, scrolling through Instagram, scrolling through Facebook, checking your email, all of those things. Even if it's just getting up and checking Facebook to see, okay, well, what happened last night while I was asleep? I know a lot of people get their news from social media, so it's definitely become a huge part of their daily ritual.
Yeah.
I know that birthdays, even, I mean, but so I recently had my birthday. I turned, I won't say the exact number, but I mean, just thinking about, you know,
I guarantee you I'm probably older than both of you are.
There's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah, Matt saying brr makes it sound like you're 80 years old and you don't want to admit that. Like you're not close to that.
I just turned 30. I could feel my body disintegrating already. But I mean, just like when you're younger, you know, your birthday even is like a ritual sort of, where, you know, you get all these presents, people sing you happy birthday, you have a party, friends show up, and then they go home. But this year, I mean, it could have everything to do with COVID, but you know, it just, the more birthdays I have, the less connected I feel to that sort of ceremony, I guess.
Right.
So in a sense, I mean, yeah, I don't know, it's lost meaning.
No, yeah. I completely understand.
Isn't it? Nicole was saying the other day how all these religions, they're basically saying the same thing, just in different ways. I'm sure Nicole would be able to articulate a little better than I.
When talking about religion, it's so hard because you don't want to say the wrong thing.
Exactly.
But also, like, you want to take into as much consideration as possible about, like, you know, like the role of semantics. Because some people will take semantics and playing around with semantics as trying to, like, bastardize a concept or an idea, or, you know, like trying to be more objective. Sometimes people will take as trying to dismiss like a whole faith. But I think it's really important to take a look at semantics and see what is similar and what are the things that religions are trying to do. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm making any points. I just started talking and I think I've lost my way.
No, you're fine. Well, when we talk about semantics, we're generally referring to supposedly different words and beliefs with strangely very similar, almost identical meanings. Mm-hmm. So the reference of certain words are the same. The idea of that word is meant to represent the sense or way that word connects us to the same idea is occasionally different. Some would argue that while specific terminology or concepts from different systems might have the same reference, their sense, how those concepts connect us to those ideas, have different connotations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
And like you said, semantics can be one of those things that can ruffle a lot of feathers. People get very irritated when you compare one spiritual concept to another, mm-hmm. even though on paper, when you're explaining what that concept is, they're essentially the same thing.
Yeah. And like, that is something that's a big fear of mine in making this show, is that because we're gonna take biblical characters, we're gonna take, you know, some characters that do exist, like we're using Hercules, we're using, you know, some Greek characters that we know won't really offend people, but then we're also taking some characters that we're playing risks with. Like we have Samson and Delilah, which are both from Judaism and Christianity, because they exist in the Old Testament, and we're taking them as characters and we're trying to fictionalize them. And I think that's something that's like this conversation about semantics and how do we play it is something that we're trying to take very seriously when we're making this show. Because, for example, I'm going to talk about the word Messiah. The concept of the Messiah in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is also slightly different. It's the same word. It comes from the Hebrew word Messiah, but in Judaism, the Messiah wasn't a savior. It was just the promised king of the Jews. But in Christianity, the idea of the Messiah became that of a savior, someone that would save all of our sins. And then in Islam, it kind of, from my research, kind of takes on a more similar meaning to the Jewish idea of Messiah, of like it was a king, but also kind of the savior of the Jews. But in each religion, they treat it differently. Like if we bring in Jesus to this equation now, because we have to, if we're talking about the Messiah, the Messiah has not come according to Judaism. Jesus was not the Messiah. He existed. He was a great prophet in his own sense, but he was not the Son of God. In Christianity, they would argue the exact opposite, and that's the whole basis of their faith. And then in Islam, also, like when we're talking about semantics and how we even just talk about religion, it's like you were saying, Sheldon, it's hard for one faith to talk to another faith. Like if we're talking about many Christians have a hard time wanting to talk about Islam or taking in any information, but Islam has Jesus as one of its characters. In Islam, it recognizes that Jesus was a Messiah of some kind, but just wasn't the Son of God. And in Islam, even if Jesus was the savior for the Jews, there's much more to do to follow the word of Allah and to follow the word of God. And we can even talk about the word God, right? It's just, I don't know. I feel like I'm ranting. There's within these three religions themselves, like one word will trigger a very different idea and a different stance, and it all comes down to like, this is what people believe, and that's why it's so
hard to
yeah.
Yeah, it really is a fine line. Yeah, that's one of the challenges we're having with writing the show, is how true do we stick to all the religions, and how much fiction do we put into it, or how much do we play around with the myth or the story itself.
First, Nicole, I don't think you're ranting at all. I actually, to go back to what you said earlier about some of your concerns with your project, I think it's very important to explore all of these belief systems. Mm-hmm. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about other shows or projects like Constantine or Hellboy or Supernatural, American Gods. There's a number of different projects out there that incorporate different mythologies and different folklore from different parts of the world. And those are the types of stories and narratives that I love the most, because it doesn't just give you one pigeonholed view of what religion or beliefs is. It lets you see a broad spectrum. And yes, though they're tweaked and catered toward entertainment purposes, they still kind of spark a slight curiosity that may encourage somebody to go and actually look into these things, these ideas on their own. And it's not hard to ruffle feathers when you're talking about religion. So I don't think that you should necessarily be concerned about them. Mm-hmm. I think as long as your intention is to portray these beliefs as respectfully as possible, that you're trying to get out an actual point, I feel as though that's what matters. I know my own personal projects, I have no disillusioned that I'm not going to offend somebody. I know I'm going to. A lot of the stories that I write, a lot of the ideas, I have a whole shared universe that I'm working on, and it's heavily inspired by theology and mythology. And I'm but I'm incorporating Christianity and Judaism and Islam and a lot of those same concepts that you guys are trying to strive for. And I know that they're going to ruffle people's feathers, but the intention isn't to do that. The intention is to actually share some of these similarities and that these same concepts exist all over the world, not just in your religion or his religion or her religion, but in everybody's. And if we start focusing on those things, that's what's going to help us to move forward. Arguing over the semantics, the
who's right.
Exactly. And I think that's where we get caught up a lot of times, is arguing over who's right. That's not going to get us anywhere ultimately. Exactly. We can disagree, but I think even if we disagree, it's important that we focus on the similarities more so than differences.
Exactly. And I like what you said about...
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
No, go, no, Matt, go. I've been talking too much.
No, I was gonna say, I like what you said about, like, if we could get people out and looking up these myths and, you know, just going, oh, great, Hercules is part of this religion. What is this religion about? And kind of start that conversation. I think that is the main goal of Mythological. That's what it's all about, right? We want to entertain everybody with all these stories, but if we could get people actually researching themselves and have spike some kind of interest in this, then, you know, I think, yeah, that would be the end goal in creating this community of not educated people, but informed.
Right. Nicole brought up the Messiah archetype, how the differences exist just between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. But the Messiah archetype exists all over the world, not just those three facets of the same Judeo-Islamic Christian system. And even with Hercules, there are comparisons that can be made. You know, when you start discussing demigods, some would argue that, and as offensive as I know it is, you know where I'm going with this. Some would argue that Jesus is considered a demigod figure.
Yeah.
So the comparison has been made, you know, in theological studies with Jesus to Hercules or, you know, other figures that also fit into that same archetype. And I don't think that when you make such comparisons, it's meant to be offensive. Instead, I think it's meant to say that, look, these same ideas and things,
they're universal.
Exactly. You know, they're not only universal, but maybe that actually even grants some legitimacy to them. The fact that these same ideas, these same archetypes exist all over the world, maybe there's more to it than what we think. You know, it's not just a quote unquote myth. Maybe there's actual fact to it.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Actually, Nicole wrote a great, and I keep pushing this because it's a great little essay. It's on the Mythological website. It's there's a satire without cruelty. I guess you could call it a tab, but Nicole wrote this essay. Wonderful essay or article, whatever you want to call it, and it's all about writing satire without cruelty. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's definitely, it could be expanded upon and worked on. And it's very early, but I think there's also just an element, because we're making an adult animated cartoon. You know, a lot of us, like, some people come up to us and they ask, like, oh, is it like South Park? Right? When we think of South Park, we're thinking like totally irreverent, very crude, and how they deal with like religion in South Park. Although I think it's interesting that they bring up religious stories like the story of Joseph Smith and the Mormons, they're actively making fun of them,
right.
Which isn't necessarily something that I think is helpful. You're trying to make a point to people. Why would you stoke the flame and poke the bear to just only arouse more like defensiveness. People are naturally going to come back at you, right? Because you're actively trying to insult them. And so like I thought it was very important, and it's still something that we're going to be working on, and it's a very important thing for Mythological, is that we want people to know that when we're writing this comedy, we're trying to do as much of our homework as possible. We are also trying to honor these religions and these traditions as much as possible because we find value in them. But what we will satirize, and we will be using these gods, these myths, these legends, these sometimes religious characters, we're going to bring them in because they'll act as surrogates for how we as humans have, delineated these messages, or how we've weaponized these messages. Because because part of the concept of the show is that there's lives at stake, in a sense. We don't really think of gods as mortal beings, but we're kind of introducing in our show that maybe they are. What if gods can die, and how does that happen? And in our show, I've kind of was inspired by the Egyptian belief that the idea of the pharaohs and their death. The ancient Egyptians believed their pharaohs to be gods, in a sense. And so when they died as mortals, they continued to live as long as there was somebody that could say their name and remember their name. But the moment that last human being dies, they're gone forever. That pharaoh, that god, is gone. And so we've taken that and we're using that for myth. We're saying, what about all the religions? What about all the gods that may have existed, but we as people have totally forgotten them? And also, we're taking, because we want to champion as many diverse gods as possible. That's why we have like a Polynesian character as one of our main characters, because it's the Polynesian people are such a small percentage of the world, and indigenous Polynesians are dying out, as consequences for a lot of what the world has done. There are entire populations of humans that are going to be erased from history. And so how do we deal with their religions and their beliefs? And so that's also part of why I think the show is important too, is that we're trying to bring to life and remember and honor the gods and cultures that most of us have forgotten.
It may be a lack of research on my own part, but are there any religions that have been forgotten?
They've been forgotten and then brought back. Sumeria is one of the oldest civilizations. I think it's the first written civilization that had a writing system. So and then you go down this rabbit hole of what about the cultures that had no writing system and everything was oral, but then their whole peoples died out. So what do we do with how do we deal with that? And I'm sure they had gods, I'm sure they had stories, because every people, every tradition has a story that unites them in some way. And how do we deal with that? What do we do with it? Are we just okay with forgetting about them?
There are definitely a number of smaller tribes I know just across the globe that have had their own pantheons that over the ages were just consumed and absorbed into the larger pantheons. So a lot of those deities, of course, were either forgotten or just added as an aspect of a more well-received, and I say that in quotes, that kind of thing. And a lot of those, doing my own research in, say, I'll use some of the Celtic and Irish deities as example. There are conflicting views and ideas on some of them, and a lot of the reasons they believe is that smaller tribes were basically just absorbed into, you know, the larger collectives and the larger communities, so their personal deities or the gods that they worship just became small, minute aspects of the much larger gods. So when you have that happen, of course, like you said, these smaller religions and smaller belief systems just kind of evaporate.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting because, I mean, that's what makes a god, right? In our show, what makes a god is the amount of believers. That's an interesting question to explore, is, you know, what actually makes, you know, a deity. I don't know if there is an answer.
I think it definitely comes down to, like you said, like it comes down to belief. It comes down to the faith that the people give it.
How often are we going to repeat their names?
Right.
Yeah.
Right? If we don't say their names, they're lost.
Yeah.
They're gone.
Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to the very big, very touchy subject of religion versus myth. That being a common debate that anyone who travels in mythology and theology circles eventually comes across. The most important thing you can do when you're becoming a part of these discussions is, of course, to be respectful. The first thought many have is that myths aren't real. They're pure fiction, yet these mythologies are based on actual beliefs and practices that did in fact exist, and their deities can be proven to be no less valid than those of the mainstream religious practices today. And that kind of brings to the point of, like you said, like what makes a god, you know, a god? Is it our beliefs in that deity, or is it something else? What makes one religion legitimate versus another one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole. Sorry.
No, Matt, go.
Well, I was gonna throw it over to you and to say, because we were talking about Shintoism and Japanese religions, right? And how I think even nowadays they're still referred to as myths. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So I think anybody who knows of Shintoism, we can all agree that it is a religion. You know, there's rituals, there's ceremonies, there's practices, there's belief. But when you're talking about the doctrine of the Kojiki or the Nihongi, which are the two like main books of Shintoism, they're referred to as the mythologies of Shintoism. In just that terminology, you're given this like conflicting image of what Shintoism is. And what I learned in my Japanese religions class, which I found very fascinating, because being someone from Japan, like my mom is from Japan, and the fact that I go so often and I do visit these shrines, I have seen how non-religious Japan has become. And part of that is due to World War II, the consequences of what religion has done. Because prior to World War II, part of the thing that allowed for that Japanese nationalism, for this rise in wanting to take over the world, came from Shintoism. It teaches that in the mythologies, in the stories of creation in Shinto, it talks about Japan being like the center and the start of all creation. And so there was a very long period of like hundreds of years where children were being taught Shintoism in schools. This doctrine was being indoctrinated into people, which was very innocent for a very long time, until government officials were searching for resources. And there's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of geopolitics involved. And there was this rise of nationalism and kind of weaponizing Shintoism so that it could justify horrible events in World War II. And so then after World War II, when Japan was defeated, and MacArthur came, religion has been basically banned in Japan. It's been told that it's not real. It shouldn't be real. Like in Shinto, the emperor is a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. So, that tie had to be cut in order to try to bring peace. But there is also an element of asking, like, was it too far? Because now Shinto, which has so many beautiful stories and so many interesting characters, I think the characters are just as interesting as maybe some like Greek mythological characters. We've got interesting stories that people believed in and can innocently believe in, but was forcibly trying to be forgotten and what is it, like,
subdued?
Subdued. Yes, subdued. Subdued is a great word. It was meant to be subdued so that it couldn't be weaponized again. But at what cost?
I think those are some of the dangers of religion, that it can be weaponized in such a way and used to just push the people to do things of that nature. And it's kind of, sometimes it's a pendulum swing. You push things so far one way to compensate, you push them so far the other way, and then there just ends up not being any sort of balance. And I think finding that balance between faith and not giving into blind faith is where we need to essentially settle. You can't be too much of one way or the other.
Absolutely. I think the differences could be chalked up to ritual. The difference between myth and religion. When you think of religion, the most go-to and common thing you think of is, going to church, praying, all these, rituals and ceremonies. When you think of myths, you don't really think of going to one location or praying to, Cthulhu or whatever it is. I don't know, what other myths do we have? I was trying to tie it back to mythological.
I mean,
yeah.
I think it's. Go ahead.
I don't know. I just I went on this whole spree. I'm like, save Japan. But anyway, I don't know. Like, I just think of how much have we decided to devalue certain religions into calling them myths, and then saying that because they're myths, they're false or they're not something that should be
weaponized.
It's like they're like you were talking about, like the pendulum swings. Because we'll look at like Native American cultures, we can look at African cultures, Polynesian cultures. Most of them tend to be animistic faiths, which have they believe in giving spirits to even inanimate objects, things like that. And so then those stories become mythology, but they were religious in a sense. Like when I was trying to do some research, I was just wanting to look at, like, let's look at a definition. A definition of a myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, typically involving supernatural beings or events. A definition of religion is a belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially of a personal god or gods. You can see how if those two definitions, they can intertwine with each other. So I think there's a point that could be made that even though I'm like getting nervous. There's a point that could be made that even though we're talking about religion, we can say that the stories within that religion are myths, of not necessarily saying that they're like falsehoods, but that they're traditional stories that shape this religion.
It's also interesting that in the definition itself, a myth has more to do with story, whereas we're approaching a line here. But I mean,
I think
Yeah.
Personally, I think the biggest difference between myth and religion is a sense of legitimacy. It's almost like the term myth is weaponized in a way to make a religion that somebody is using the term to describe as less than. You're using myth to describe a religion in a way to make it less legitimate than a more prominent practice or belief system.
Yeah.
You wouldn't use myth to refer to Islam or Christianity, but you would use myth to refer to Shintoism or even the Yoruba religions, all of which are still practiced today. And a lot of times people will argue that myths are dead religions, except many of the pantheons within these myths are still acknowledged and even worshipped today, especially with the rise of neo-paganism. We're seeing now that religions that evolved around the Greek, Norse, and even the Celtic pantheons have experienced a resurgence in recent years. So even those belief systems are no longer dead, if they were ever entirely dead. So I think it ultimately comes down to, what are you believing to be legitimate?
Yeah.
And if it's something you feel is in fact a legitimate belief system, then you're going to call it religion. If it's something that you feel has less of a value or less of a legitimacy, then you're probably going to refer to that as a myth.
Yeah. And I think it also comes down to, like, who has the power to make that distinction?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's
like throughout history.
Main points, yes.
Yeah, because I think, like you brought up neo-paganism, which the word pagan nowadays isn't as bad as it was maybe like if we're talking Salem, Massachusetts, right? With witchcraft, for example. The Catholic Church used the word pagan to make these non-Catholic, these non-Christian religions invalid, as you were saying. So it's just kind of looking at history and coming to a point, I think, with society today, with individuals today, and making the decision ourselves of who decided that, one religion is better than another, that one religion is more valid than the other. Why is it so hard to think that many religions can be valid?
The funny part about the term pagan, going back to semantics and the meaning of words, is it never actually even meant something to the effect of witchcraft or anything. And
really,
it was actually, if I recall, and I'm paraphrasing, the term pagan basically meant like country folk. It was meant to describe, people that lived out in the country. They were maybe more akin to like herbalists, and maybe they paid a little more attention to just nature than whatever belief system was going on at the time. But they were essentially, people that were of the land. It was originally never meant to be, I guess, a religious title in the first place. But again, we go back to how words are weaponized. And I think that's one of those things. And even today, not to go into politics, but we see how certain phrases are used in a weaponized manner, and people will just hear them and all of a sudden these images pop up in their head. When
absolutely,
if you actually go and look into the meaning of these terms, it usually doesn't mean what these people think it means.
Yeah. Or that these practices are what people are trying to say that they are.
Exactly.
That these religions stand for what some people say that they should be, or say that they are standing for.
It's sort of personified in a way, right? It's like, you believe in this, so you are this belief. This is what you are. This is who you are, right? And you are this, you are this.
That's one of the things that I love about projects like Mythological, bringing it around. I know as Nicole said earlier, there's the concerns about offending people, but I think it's so important to still have these things because it stokes the fires of curiosity and it puts those ideas in people's heads that maybe what I thought this was isn't what it actually is or has ever been. So maybe I need to go and look into it on my own. I know a lot of times if I'm watching something like Lost Girl and I hear, any kind of mythological term, even though it's not the way they use it on the show isn't the same that actually existed in, mythology or, the past, but it makes me actually go and look up what that creature is or what that deity was, how it was perceived originally. And it actually, makes you step outside of your box and your own comfort zone to see what these things are instead of what I'm trying to be very polite here. Your limited-minded neighbors or those around you may have originally told them to be. Sometimes it's very important for you to do research on your own, to actually step outside of, that tiny little bubble of yours. And I think with projects like Mythological, that's a lot more likely to happen than if, they didn't exist in the first place. I appreciate what you guys are trying to do. And I think it's a very important thing that needs to be done. I think more projects like this or some of the shows I've already named, even comic series that I've seen, like I have a friend that works on a comic series called Is Nana the Were-Spider. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's very heavily inspired by African theology and Haitian culture and stuff like that. And I know you've heard me talk about Nazi before, the trickster story spider god of West African folklore. And his whole story basically picks up with his protagonist being the son of a Nazi. And he incorporates all of this different theology and stories. And it's definitely a way to bring modern day attention to these old stories that might not have ever come about otherwise. So I feel like these kind of stories, mythological and stuff like that, are extremely important.
Absolutely. It's just so much easier to access, right? I think I forget who said this, but it may have been a comedian or some artist out there, but they said the best way, I'm gonna butcher this completely, but he said something about the best way to tell people the truths or to get them to accept the truth is to shove it down their throats while they're laughing, or to make them laugh and then while their mouths are open, shove it down their throats, something like that. I butchered it completely, but I think in an attempt,
inspiring, Matt.
Thank you for it. But I mean, I think that's it's making it easy.
I actually think that that's always been one of the most important roles of comedians, is that they're able to give you a spoonful of medicine, with a little bit of sugar added. Absolutely. To help it go down that much easier.
Yeah. What we're doing is we're taking the whipped cream and just
Yeah.
Whatever it takes.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of these debates can be never ending, yet they can also be very interesting and fun to have. And I think the most important thing is that all parties involved remain considerate and respectful.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's one of the I forget what the rule is, but we're encouraging it on our website, on all our platforms. We're encouraging the conversation to happen. But and of course things are going to come up, topics are going to come up that people may take offense to. As part of this conversation, we definitely encourage.
And I think that's bound to happen. I think there's always, as we've all already said, there's going to be feathers that get ruffled. People are going to get offended or get upset, especially when they hold something so close to their heart and so personally. It's easy for them to get upset when they feel like, and I think that's another danger of religion, is that people often identify it as a huge part of who they are. Like they can't distinguish themselves from these beliefs. So when you start to question or compare to other belief systems, it becomes a very just unnerving subject for them. I think that's another reason why it's so important to look outside of your comfort zone, to question, to explore, and to understand other perceptions outside of your own.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think also another aspect of that too is that we have to be okay with not always having to force somebody to agree with you. That there's not always going to be a right answer or, a correct answer, especially when we're talking about religions or belief systems. People believe what they will believe. Sometimes we hope that they'll change their minds, but at the end of the day, what people really want is to be heard, and for their stories to be heard. And so that's kind of an aspect and an element while we're developing this show, because we're still like in this development phase. We're looking to pitch the show to hopefully be able to get some funding, to be able to get people to back us up and champion for us. We want to start small. We want to start building a community. We have our Facebook group that we want to have like a forum and discussion. We want people to bring up their favorite myths.
I think that's the biggest thing, right? Is this community that we're trying to build as well. And just, because although we are developing this, I think the more we can involve everybody, the more of a conversation we can have, right?
Yeah.
If we say,
like
right,
I love that.
Yeah. Like my ideal writer's room for this show would be like, we show up every Monday, first day, okay, let's go.
Monday.
And whatever, whenever our week starts. We come in fresh and we go, like, the first thing we talk about is, what did you see? What did the community see? What's interesting the people? What are we hearing? What are our audiences and the people that this show is made for? What do they want to hear, and how do we bring that to them, but also try to enlighten them to think more broadly? So on our website, which is Mythological, theseries.com, we do have a forum that's open for people to. We can start open discussions. We can just drop in a myth or two or a religious story. We want this collaborative process to be transparent, because I think that's also an element of where communication goes wrong, is that people stop being transparent. Even like religious bodies stop being transparent and stop being for the people and for the, like what the moral of the story is supposed to be. So we kind of, we want to get back in touch with that and try to bring people together as much as possible. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
We're just a couple of hopeless romantics for all of humanity.
Nice. I think we need more of that. Less of the fighting and the arguing.
Absolutely.
More of the open dialogue. And I think, to add on to what you were already saying, I think it's important that we also learn that we don't have to be right all the time. That maybe, as much as we want to believe our own views, our own perspectives and beliefs, maybe, just maybe, somebody else's is just as viable as our own. So I don't think that necessarily means that we have to be wrong, but we don't know until we know. So why want to hurt each other over the possibility that, they're wrong and we're right, or we're wrong and they're right?
Yeah, we'll see if those pearly gates show up at the end of our lives.
Exactly. Until then, we won't actually know, will we?
Exactly. We won't know till we get there, right? Yep.
But we can have fun while we're here.
Exactly.
Well, I feel like we could go on for hours, but it's probably best we end things here. I just wanted to thank both of you again for joining me tonight. It's been a blast. It's been a really fun conversation. And
you, Sheldon.
Thank you.
I definitely don't often get to nerd out about these topics. And as Nicole was saying earlier, it's very easy to ruffle feathers when you start talking about these things. Do you two have any further thoughts that you'd like to share?
Look us up on our website. Again, I will repeat it. Mythological, theseries.com. We also have an Instagram account, which is at Mythological the Series. Very original. And hopefully there'll be more to come. We'll try to post updates as much as possible. Right now, we're mostly just trying to introduce our characters. And we're still steadily trying to grow, but we want to
trying to birth this world and create.
We're creating a creation myth for creation myths. Like, honestly, it's been exhausting.
And I think the more we can learn to love each other.
I'm definitely looking forward to seeing your project come out.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheldon.
Matt, any further thoughts or any particular place you'd like your...
No, I mean, I would encourage everyone to follow us on the website. Basically, all the information is there, and contribute to the forum we have going. Because I think once we can get some conversations started, then we can start to develop this thing further and actually build this community that we're trying to build. Right?
Definitely.
The more we know, the better we can make this show.
Exactly.
Right. And Nicole, I'm definitely looking forward to reading that essay. You know, I want to read that, right?
It's really short. It's like more bullet points than anything. But yeah, I think it's a start. But thank you.
Everything starts with a seed, so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both again, and I'd like to end with another quote. All religions are true, but none are literal. Joseph Campbell. Stay safe, try to learn from, understand, and be tolerant of one another. Until next time, assalamu alaikum and namaste. Peace be with you until we meet again. Thanks for listening to me as I've nerded out about stories and beliefs. Join me next week as I journey down the rabbit hole once again by subscribing and listening wherever podcasts are available. Who knows? Maybe then we'll be one step closer to glimpsing the true nature of faith and fear. Music for this podcast is brought to you by Delo 1954X and Toby Lane from Pixabay.com.